I have a confession. I left Washington, D.C. not necessarily because of personal reasons. For those who don't know me, my name is Abby, and I've been a volunteer and leader for Rise Up for Abortion Rights in the Los Angeles chapter. I have organized protests, led marches, managed the TikTok and social media accounts, been in parades with them, volunteered to deliver supplies, done phone banks. I helped hang the banner in the Dodgers stadium that caused me to be banned for the season. And I went to Washington, D.C. following Rise Up's call for everyone to go to D.C. and stay so that I could tackle the cause at the source. I arrived at the Supreme Court at 4 p.m. Monday, June 13th. I had planned on staying until Sunday, but I ended up only staying with Rise Up for Abortion Rights until Thursday morning and leaving D.C. Friday. Although it was one of the most difficult weeks of my life and I definitely did need rest, I left when I did as a direct result of experiences I had with the national members of Rise Up for Abortion Rights. There are several reasons why I have chosen to release this statement and why now. For starters, Rise Up is continuing to call more people to DC, and I want to be transparent about how difficult it will be. I also did feel that there were institutional problems that left me feeling deceived and maybe lied to, and feel everyone should see my experiences. Secondly, as you will find out, I no longer support Rise Up. And since I have been a face for them and continue to be on TikTok, I feel I should say something. Lastly, I am worried that the organization is using abusive tactics to recruit and keep people around. And since Rise Up has done so much outreach to high schoolers, I feel this is important for parents to consider. It has become apparent to me that there are several issues on not only a logistical and organizational level, but also an ethical one. For starters, anyone planning on going to DC needs to understand just how difficult it will be. It was very hot, 90s, humid, standing in the sun all day. You were getting food and hygiene where and when you could get it, and not necessarily on a regular schedule. And the counter protesters were brutal, laughing at us, mocking us, becoming physical, taking our talking points and literally throwing them back at us, and they outnumbered us. Regardless of anything, if you're planning on going to DC, just please prepare yourself for how physical and emotional it will be. There will be a lot of physical and emotional obstacles you'll have to overcome. It could totally be worth it. Just know that going in. In regards to logistics and organization, I feel that DC was a failed call to action. Rise Up made the call for everyone to come to DC without seeming to make many plans for it. Most of this isn't a reason to be against them. It was just a result of people who see an important issue that needs to be addressed and figuring it out as they go. They knew that this was important and they're trying to make it happen with what they have. Personally, I expected them to at least have a DC chapter or locals in the area that they were partnering with. They did not. They also struggled to accomplish what was a massive task, the call to DC and stay, the Occupy DC, with the little leadership they did have. And this caused many issues that discouraged people who came and participated. Communication was horrible. Planned protests were always later than advertised, and there didn't seem to be much coordination. It was also very obvious that the funds were basically non-existent, and there was a lot of stress to people once they'd already made it to DC that they needed to fundraise for themselves and their chapters. This was not something that was mentioned prior to going to DC, and there were several members who followed the call on a promise from Rise Up of housing, food, and protection. This made things on site incredibly stressful for everyone and left a lot of people feeling unstable, misled, and abandoned. I will say, however, that it never came down to people not having housing. They did always figure it out, and it did seem like they were starting to figure out their organization and how to function things before I left DC. So these are things that could have been resolved at this point. However, a group of volunteers in DC stepped up to help leadership. Meetings were had where genuine resolutions were made. People were feeling more confident that things were getting done in a way that was sustainable for everyone. Basically, people who weren't part of National stepped up to help become leaders, and we were making progress. This was done from Monday evening to Tuesday evening, but this was before Sansara showed up. Sansara is the leader of Rise Up for Abortion Rights. Now, I must say, Sansara was in DC and had been at the Monday morning protests that I missed. But she didn't come back to the group on site and the other leaders until Wednesday's protest at 8 a.m. And she didn't arrive until after 9 a.m. So the majority of what I had worked on with people on the ground was completely outside of Sansara's leadership. I feel like Sansara showing up actually hurt the progress we were starting to make. But it was a meeting that we had after Wednesday's protest that caused the biggest issues. A person in the group suggested that the language Rise Up uses should be more gender inclusive. This isn't the first time I've heard this. There have been several times we've discussed this in the LA chapter. However, in the LA chapter, it didn't seem like that big of an issue. We had trans members who were very active in the chapter, and there didn't seem to be much pushback. We decided that we should keep terms like forced motherhood as female enslavement because it tackles the conservative agenda, and we also don't want to leave women out. But when this person in DC suggested it in this meeting, it seemed a bit more off to me. There were about 10 of us in the meeting, and it seemed all the members who were not part of leadership supported the idea of not removing words like women and motherhood, but just making an effort to come up with more chants that are also gender inclusive. Then Sansara goes on a rant about how these words are important because we need to not silence women, but her speech was so defensive to a group that wasn't disagreeing with her. None of us thought we should remove the words mother and women. No one was saying that. And yet she was arguing with us about it. I specifically mentioned that I think this was important because we were actively being called TERFs. And as a white woman, it's an image I struggle not to be a part of. I mentioned it's very important that we just make sure we are letting our audiences know that we aren't anti-trans. But rather than just a general agreement, we were met with more speeches from Sansara about the silencing of women's rights and the problem with cancel culture. Her speech was followed by a couple more from members of National who are also RevComs. And now we get to the association between RevCom and Rise Up for Abortion Rights, which is the thing that has made Rise Up most controversial amongst the activist and leftist community. For starters, I'll discuss what my experience in LA was. I noticed that RevComs and Rise Ups were closely associated, but it was my understanding that the only reason for that was because some of the founding members of the LA chapter were also part of RevComs. So it wasn't that the organizations were connected, it was just that they helped each other. Even though they had a RevCom table passing out flyers at every single event and advertised themselves on the mic at every protest and used the same graphics and shared storage space and posted Rise Up's videos on RevCom socials before Rise Up's, I'd later find out this did go all the way to the top and that the founders of the whole organization were also RevCom. That isn't that much of a secret. It's something I should have done better research on. But it didn't bother me working with communists, because I felt our differences don't matter at this point in time. The cause is what's most important. But I started to experience a lot of pushback because of this. Volunteers felt uncomfortable joining us. Online people were calling us cults. Other organizations refused to work with us, even those who openly supported the cause. I was so frustrated because I'd be willing to volunteer with anyone fighting this cause. But literally no other organization in the area was doing the same thing Rise Up was doing. No one was protesting anymore. There was one day after the draft leak, then it was just Rise Up doing everything. I was frustrated that organizations cared more about some things. I was frustrated that organizations cared more about the differences than the cause. But I did notice in the LA chapter over time some things I didn't like. I didn't like how closely the two chapters were related, but continued to believe this was an LA chapter problem that would be solved once we got more members. When I arrived to DC, I noticed all the leaders from National and several other volunteers were RevComs. One man was staying in our housing that I don't believe even volunteered with Rise Up. I believe he was only a RevCom. And just like in LA, we were getting a lot of pushback from people because of the association with RevComs. Even more than we were in LA, actually. No one would work with us. And this was during a time that we needed it more than anything. We were in DC in front of the Supreme Court on Decision Day, and our protests were pathetically small, and there were more pro-life counter-protesters than we had, which is especially horrible when you take into consideration that we are not the minority. Most people in this country support abortion access. So why aren't more people coming out? That's the question that was asked in the meeting on Wednesday with Sansara. Of course, there are a ton of reasons why people don't come out. They're exhausted from all the issues in this country. They feel hopeless. They can't handle the hate coming from the other side. People have jobs that don't give them the opportunity to come out, etc., etc. But when the question, what can we do to bring more people out, came up, the association with RevCom was mentioned. And most people there seemed to agree that it was a problem. But they didn't want to listen. By they, I mean Sansara and the leaders from National. Sansara went on a speech about how even though we've had many individuals and organizations tell us this, that it's just an excuse. That if they really cared about the cause, they'd be out here no matter what. They refused to listen to us. When someone asked, but shouldn't we tackle the small issues that are easier first and then tackle the societal problems? And someone else asked, aren't we trying to get as many people out here? It was met with a rant from Sansara about how if they let differences divide us, then they clearly don't care about the cause. The amount that the leaders repeated this made me feel that their attitude was, if they don't like us because we're RevCom, we'll screw them. Which was the opposite of how I thought Rise Up worked. I had always been told that we welcome differences, but now I was being told that if they don't agree with us, screw them. I thought that they wanted to bring as many people in as possible, regardless of differences. It got to the point that I asked Sansara directly, okay, so if someone were to ask me if Rise Up is connected to RevComs, what would you say? I used to tell people no, but now I feel like that would be a lie. She answers with a quick answer about how they are completely separate organizations, like shrugging their shoulders. She's like, yeah, of course they're two separate organizations. But then she went on to talk about Bob Avakian and how BA is an important leader to our movement, and we need to be listening to him and using him as a resource. This was what really struck me. Because for those who don't know, Bob Avakian is the leader of RevComs. But Bob Avakian is not associated with Rise Up at all. He isn't in DC. He isn't part of the organization. He hasn't been to a single protest or event in our name. He is just some intelligent old white man who is in isolation, who writes informative essays. Bob Avakian is not the leader of Rise Up. Sansara should be, but this is her opinion. And this is not what I signed up for. I was okay working with individuals who disagree with me politically, but I'm not okay with working with an organization that I can no longer truthfully say is not RevCom. To add to all this, it didn't help that the whole meeting seemed like a rally from Sansara and not actually a cohesive meeting where everyone had an equal say. I left the meeting feeling like I'd been manipulated into working for the advancement of the RevComs, and that when the counter-protesters called us TERFs, there was a chance that they were right. And then I did some more research and found out that rumor has it, the RevComs create other nonprofits to use to financially profit and or recruit to the RevComs. I have heard other people mention to me that they have noticed times that it seems the RevCom members have advanced the RevCom agenda before the Rise Up one, such as handing out RevCom flyers, recruiting at protests, and using Rise Up to spread Bob Avakian's essays exclusively. RevComs has all the footage created for Rise Up and oftentimes posts on RevCom socials before posting on Rise Up's. People have warned me that RevComs is a cult, and although I don't feel I have enough knowledge to claim that, there were two practices that made me feel at least leaned towards one. One, they act like Bob Avakian is their absolute leader, even though he's not physically involved at all. I have yet to hear anything about new communism from the RevComs and what they actually believe politically, but I've heard a lot about BA. And two, RevComs seem loyal to RevCom first, not the causes, and aim to recruit people and keep them on in a way that reminded me of an organized religion. I was prepared to put it to the side for the cause and decide what I wanted to do about it later. But how things were handled about the meeting with the other leaders, how things were handled after the meeting, made me feel worse. I tried to stress that I needed space to recoup and felt guilt-tripped. I tried to stress that I needed space to recoup and I felt guilt-tripped. I was told we need to think about the women right now the most. Meanwhile, I had spent the previous night on the concrete floor in front of the Supreme Court and had physically protested in the area by myself on a bullhorn all day the day before. I felt gaslit and taken advantage of because I personally felt like I was physically doing more than most of the leaders. When issues arose that needed to be discussed, they continued to bring up Bob Avakian the whole time and how important he is to the movement. And several people would become very defensive when my issues were expressed. These are my personal interpretations of private conversations, but it was enough to make me feel worse about all my experiences rather than better. There were also other people with me who left Rise Up who were neurodivergent and or disabled. And they felt like their needs were expressed, and even though when they were expressed, they weren't understood, and they came to the conclusion that this was a very ableist group. The focus on the ground from Rise Up didn't seem to care about what they were The people on the ground from Rise Up didn't seem to care about what they were putting people through by pushing them to be acting 24/7 while out of state, physically exerted, and many with little to no funds. And this behavior continued when I went home to LA amongst the people in the LA chapter, who I thought were different. I was villainized by the DC team to the members of LA during a time that all I was trying to do was get some space and withdrawal. They continued to contact me. They told me I could return to Rise Up, quote, on the basis of what it is and what their slogans and principles are. When I asked how have I not been doing that, I was told about my experiences in the meeting, about the times that I expressed my concern in Washington, D.C. I have not spoken to the LA chapter about any of my experiences in D.C., so this means that the national team has been spreading information about me that I'm not even sure is completely accurate. I read a quote this week that said, "Manipulation is when they repeatedly disrespect you and want you to be the bigger person to let their bullshit slide." And I think that has very accurately described my experiences. After a conversation went horribly with some of leadership in DC, I decided to leave immediately. I got an Airbnb, took 2 friends with me, and booked my flight for the next day. I have struggled with this because there doesn't seem to be any good solution. I would just volunteer with another organization, but there aren't any, in the LA area at least, that have the same mission statement as Rise Up. Rise Up believes it's easier to fight for a right while we still have it than it will be to win it back once it's gone. And therefore, immediate movements are urgent and necessary. I agree with this. And there are no other organizations in my area even planning protests. I agree with Rise Up's general methods in regard to marches, disruptions, and nonviolent civil disobedience. And the last thing I want to do was come out with this information and hurt the cause. However, because of my withdrawal of support and worry about people and students going to DC, as well as my personal fear of being retaliated against, I am releasing this information. They have already decided to remove me from all the Rise Up chats and have kicked me out of the social medias. I don't know if that's because they fear that I'm going to retaliate or if this is because of my expressions of concern. By no means am I calling out individuals or saying that Rise Up does not care about the cause. And people volunteering with them should use discretion when deciding how to move forward. What they are doing is important and necessary, and especially when looking at individual chapters, they might not be doing more harm than good. But personally, I felt deceived, and I don't want my comrades to feel and experience the same thing. However, I'm not done fighting. I'm going to be leading my own protests under the movement, the Resistance Coalition LA. The Resistance Coalition DC was founded by my fellow comrades who separated themselves from Rise Up for abortion rights and intended on uniting organizations in DC to protest the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I plan on using a similar mission statement to Rise Up and similar methods here in Los Angeles. This way, people in my area can continue protesting in a way they support, but separate from an organization they don't. I completely understand anyone who decides to continue working with Rise Up despite the information that I've revealed. Because I know the cause can be that important. And these are my experiences, and other people might be experiencing different things. However, I do not feel comfortable being a face for Rise Up anymore, and I personally will no longer be supporting the organization. I worry that due to me having been so close to Rise Up will affect my image and my movement in a negative way. And I hope that anyone who is considering working with me will take this very long letter into account when casting judgment. My intentions were not to retaliate against Rise Up, but rather release the information to the public so people have the information before volunteering. In fact, after releasing this, I hope I can just move on from all of it. This has been a very difficult process for me, and it's been difficult to process. And I feel like the ways that I've been treated since beginning to feel this way by the people in the organization has just turned this into an incredibly triggering experience. I just want to do good. I don't need all of this. All I wanted was to help people. But I will keep fighting. I am not giving up. We will not stop. We won't go back.